certainly want to thank Stony Creek Inn for their continued support of law enforcement, and I appreciate the fact that they made this room available for us today so we have somewhere to hold our press conference. And I also want to thank you all, the media. I appreciate your interest in public safety issues in Columbia, and I'm glad that you're here. As some of you may know, CPOA, Columbia Police Officers Association, is the member organization that represents the men and women who don the uniform every day at the Columbia Police Department, put themselves in harm's way for the benefit of every person, resident or visitor, young or old, criminal or law-abiding. Any person who finds himself inside the city limits of the city of Columbia, the police officers are there to protect them. I'm the executive director of the Columbia Police Officers Association, and when I refer to we, I'm talking about the officers whom I represent. I'm not one of them, but I'm their director. CPOA represents about 80% of the police officers at the department, and I've lost track a very large number of retired police officers from the Columbia Police Department. CPOA speaks for those officers of the CPD, of the Columbia Police Department. We do not speak for the department, the city, or any other entity. We're here today to start the discussion of a serious and feasible solution to the crime problem that plagues Columbia. And what we're asking for today is not out of self-interest. We're not here to discuss, some overdue pay issues or issues concerning pay, benefits, terms, conditions of employment, each of which are important and I think need attention. And those are important both personally and professionally of the officers. That's not what we're here today. We're here today because the police officers care about the safety of this community. It's our community. We care about it. And as you may guess, policing is not a profession that you enter into if you are looking for, warm, fuzzy hugs and pats on the back and lots of thanks. It's a profession of men and women who genuinely care about the safety and security of the people they protect on a daily basis. Now, for quite some time, the media, local news especially, has been increasingly filled with reports of auto theft, burglary, armed robbery, assault, rape, arson, shots fired, home invasions, illegal guns, and homicide in our community. And as an aside, I'll say just a recent development, I think this was in the news a week ago, the ATF has again assigned additional ATF agents just to Columbia because the ATF has recognized that Columbia has the most violent gun crime per capita of any city in the state. So we beat St. Louis. In addition, we have all seen in the media the examples of criminal activity in Columbia. We also have a fairly recent citizen survey, and it's one that was commissioned by the city, not by the police officers or anybody else, that tells us, and you have the handout there, tells us that the citizens believe public safety is their number one concern. It's the thing that they want addressed first and foremost in the city. On the other hand, some of our city leaders have told us this is just a summertime problem, this is not a gang problem, this is just a perception problem. And with all due respect, we submit those assertions simply are not true. Crime does spike in the summer, we'll admit that, but crime in Columbia is not just a summer problem. And if you look at the one handout I gave you that shows, shots fired, for example, and I printed it, and that's information you get off CPD, provides a wonderful source of data on their webpage, and I applaud them for that. You can look on there, and the shots fired last December compared to the shots fired this month, I don't know, what were there, 33 last December and 37 this month. I mean, there's a difference, but not a huge difference. It's not like this is just isolated to the summertime. And as to, is there a gang problem? Some of the city leaders, I think the city manager has repeatedly said that we do not have a gang problem. Well, I think we know something he doesn't, because I think we do have a gang problem. The police officers have addressed it. And as recently as July 9th, in an interview on a local, I think on the ABC affiliate, Mayor McDavid acknowledged that we have a gang problem here. So the city council is aware of it and has talked about addressing it, although I will say that from what I understand, the mayor said the council will give the Anti-Violence Youth Task Force 1 year to come up with a suggestion. And the officers don't think a solution a year from now is the answer to the problem. And then as to the perception, whether this is a perception or not, first of all, I mean, perception is reality. If there's a crime at your home, there's a crime problem, whether it exists elsewhere or not. But I would also, and I grew up in Columbia, I mean, went to Grant Elementary School. I'm an old timer here. When we have a shootout in Columbia at 10th and Broadway, downtown Columbia, when we have running gun battles between cars on the street, when we have door-to-door crime on Grant Lane, Teakwood Court, and Frontenac, when a woman who just celebrated her 17-year-old son's high school graduation has to turn around weeks later and plan his funeral, then I think we have a very real crime problem, and it is not a perception. So the question that we're addressing is, how do we get this back under control? And to date, we have heard the police officers, the Columbia Police Officers Association certainly has heard one suggestion that makes sense, is easily obtainable within the city budget, and is supported by facts already on the record. We don't have to develop a task force to go look for answers. We already have them. And as an aside, I'll tell you, the facts came out recently that 15 years ago, the city of Columbia had 69 officers assigned to their patrol division. And those are the frontline public safety officers who are out on the street every day, patrolling and intercepting crime and preventing crime. 69 officers 15 years ago. Today we have 68. Now I know there are some officers who have been put into other capacities that also engage in crime prevention and addressing crimes, but nevertheless we have a smaller patrol division, from what we understand, than what we had 15 years ago. What we need are more feet on the street. We need officers on the street. I mean, I know there are important duties to be performed in the office, but we believe what we need are more feet on the street. So the one solution that we have heard, and which we wholeheartedly endorse, has come from Chief Burton. As you may know from the history of law enforcement and the CPOA in Columbia, there's been some differences of opinion between the chief and CPOA. When I started with CPOA 6 months ago, I made it clear, the things we disagree on, there are things we agree on. Let's work on the things we agree on. And that's what I'm actively trying to do. And I had lunch with the chief about 3 weeks ago. He provided me with documentation, a copy of which I have given you, and advised me that he had made a request to the city. It's budget time. He has made a request to the city for 38 additional officers, and I believe a few non-commissioned officers, because there are a lot of duties that don't need necessarily to be done by commissioned officers. And I didn't hear any gasps, but I know that 38 officers may sound like a lot, it may sound generous, but instead of adding the necessary number of officers that the department has needed year by year and managing sort of the upkeep of the department, we have what I would call, staffing disrepair. It's fallen into disrepair because the staffing has not been maintained by the city, whomever that has been over the last 20 or 30 years. And so now we have to play catch up, and that's always an expensive process. But the nice thing about this is when the chief says, and there's his documentation and more that I'll tell you about, that we believe we need 38 new officers and maybe a few civilians, there's several things that support that. First of all, I've put up a map of the city of Columbia, and if you can look at how big this map is, when I go out and do public speaking, pachyderms, Lions Club, thing like that, I always ask them, how many officers do you think are on the street at any one time? And invariably the answer is somewhere between 24 and 40. One of the officers told me when he reported for work night before last, there were 7 officers on duty, including himself. 7 officers to patrol the entire city of Columbia. And that doesn't happen all the time. I mean, that certainly is not the standard at which they aim, but it does happen. And it's not because of poor management, it's because of inadequate resources. And it's not uncommon that there will only be 9 or 10 officers patrolling the entire town. And as you'll see from the data provided by the chief, most calls require 2 officers, sometimes 3. When the shooting and whatever other criminal activity happened on Grant Lane a week ago, whenever that was, I think there were 9 officers that responded to that neighborhood. We've asked, we haven't gotten the answer yet, but that may have been every officer in town was on Grant Lane at that shooting, which means the rest of the town was unprotected. And we don't feel comfortable with that. The officers want to do a better job. And I know the chief wants them to be able to do a better job. He's the one who's asked for more officers. So in addition to that, there's a condition called status 0. Status 0 occurs when there's no officer available to respond to a call. And that happens far more often than we like and far more often than you would think. When every officer in town is busy and the next call that comes in, that's just going to have to wait. Whatever it is, we're status zero. So, you know, we all know the crime that goes on, whether it's a perception or reality. You can look at the statistics, and I've provided some of that for you. But the other justification, in addition to the document the chief provided, this 535-page document I requested for the department, it's public information, they gave it to me. That document shows all overtime worked by employees of the Columbia Police Department from July 2012 to July 2013. The number of hours of overtime worked in that 1 year period was 34,700 some odd hours, 35,000 hours of overtime in 1 year by our police officers and their non-commissioned employees. So that's assuming the department's following labor requirements and paying time and a half. We are paying for 52,000 hours, 52,120 and a half hours of straight time for people that we don't have. I mean, we're paying the equivalent of 25 full-time officers that we don't have, which means when you ask for 38 officers, we're already paying for 25 of them. I mean, we're not paying their benefits, we'll admit that, but we are already paying the salary that would cover 25 full-time officers, but we don't have their help. And what that means is the officers we do have are working 12 to 16-hour days, long weeks, they have mandatory overtime, and they are now, although they were promised this would not happen, mandatory training on their day off. These are dedicated people, and they want to do the job, but you can only do that for so long before you get into, you know, fatigue issues, morale issues. I'm not saying any of these officers are careless, but no human can work 12, 16-hour days and continue that for any period of time and maintain peak performance. So the burnout, we have a lot of turnover in the department, and I think one of the results is we don't have criminals that are out of control, we have criminals who are in control. I mean, they seem to have control of certain neighborhoods, and that's just a fact. So back to the chief's request, we support wholeheartedly, we need more feet on the street. He's asked for 38 officers. We know that we're already paying for 25 of them. What about the other 13 officers? And how are you going to pay for the benefits for these officers? Because that's no small matter. Again, I gave you documentation in one of the handouts. This past April, we voted for a 911 Joint Communications Center. The city has already told us, and the city council in their minutes pledged, that if that passed, and it did, the money that the city formally spent to support the 911 center would be spent on public safety. And at one point we were told that was $2.2 million, and then in the paper the other day it said $1.7 million. I don't know where the other $500,000 went, but no matter what it is, there's plenty enough money that's going to be readily available, no tax required, no increase. It's in the budget to pay the cost of the officers that we need. So, as you can see, I mean, we're not asking for a tax increase. We're not asking to take money from any other department. We're asking for money that already exists, that to some extent that's already being spent on 25 different or the equivalent of 25 officers. And, you know, I'll try and anticipate one question. If we have 38 new officers, is that going to solve the problem? Not completely. I mean, there are other problems that will always need to be addressed, but I can tell you this, without adequate manpower, we certainly won't solve the problem. I mean, we cannot keep making these officers work this much overtime, work their days off, and have the city push that much overtime onto the employees we have and expect to get any kind of a good result. And I think if you look at the citizen survey, and I provided URL, web page link to every piece of data I gave you so you can check my facts and figures, and I'd be happy to give you the 535-page document electronically. But the citizens in their survey have said public safety is number one. That's what we want. We're not as happy as we used to be, and it's now our number one priority. So in response to that, the Police Officers Association is asking for your help. We're asking business leaders, community leaders, residents, and neighborhood associations, if you want a safer Columbia, and if you want the Columbia we used to have, then we've got to act. We've got to stand up and be counted and follow what we think is a very appropriate recommendation from the Chief of Police, and that is add the officers that are needed to this department. So, sorry if that was lengthy. I'll be happy to answer questions as much as you want. And